I just finished making my drop stitch braid scarf to match the hat that I did a few tutorials back. So I will show step by step how I make this. I ran into a few problems making this that I didn't think about when I started to make the scarf. So I'm going to show you straight through how I made it, but I'll also give you some tips and tricks that I think will make it easier the next time I go to make this. And I'll also make some supplementary videos about the different ways I might go about making this, but we'll go straight through. So this will be, I think, about a 3-part tutorial with then another supplementary video about how to make it slightly easier to close up those ends. So let's get going on making the drop stitch braid scarf, purl side facing out. So first we're going to cast on with our waste yarn, and this is a similar weight yarn to your project yarn, but in a contrasting color. I start at my white 48th needle and I go over and under each needle one time around till we get back to the white needle. That is our cast on, and this does not count as a row. So once we get back to our white needle, I put it down all the way into our yarn holder, and I recommend cranking more between 7 and 10 rows for our waste yarn. The reason being is at this point, once you get done cranking your rows, what I recommend to do is to get your corded needles, cast it off, flip it to the knit side, because right now you see the purl side facing up, and then put it back on your machine, then add on your project yarn and start cranking your rows. When I go to cast off, I will show you how to cast off with your knitted needles and how to flip this. I do that at the end because that's how we create our drop stitch. If you don't want to do that at this point, feel free to add on your project yarn or wait till all the videos are out and I will show you how to do this. So for a scarf, it doesn't matter how many rows. It depends on how many rows or how long of a scarf you want to make. I ended up doing about 320 rows to make a nice long scarf. But if you want a shorter scarf, you can do less rows. If you want to do a longer scarf, you can even do more rows. That's completely up to you. That's what's really awesome about scarves. You can make them as short or as long as you would like. So as I'm finishing cranking my rows, I did move my machine so the handle's facing me, and that just helps kind of more ergonomically with my shoulder. And now here is the cast off. Here is how I cast off with my knitting needles that are corded, because we need to do the drop stitch. And the only way to do that, because this is so long of a scarf, is we need to remove it from our machine. So I have these corded knitting needles, and I start at my number 1 needle. I do take the yarn out of the yarn holder, and then I start to pick up each stitch just like you would do a normal cast off. And then I'm taking my stitch marker here so I can mark the number 1 stitch and the 48th stitch so I know where the start and stop is of my round. And so these are called circular knitting needles because they have the cord attaching the 2 knitting needles together, so you can keep your project in the round like it is on the machine. And so you just want to take your time at this point and pick up your stitches just like you would if you were casting off with a needle and thread. But this is it's just a little bit easier than using a needle and thread using the knitting needles, because we're going to be moving our stitches around so we can drop the stitches to make our braid. And then we are also going to put the project back on the machine to add on waste yarn. So if this intimidates you a little bit, go back to my hat tutorial where I did the drop stitch braid, because the hat is a lot shorter and you don't have to remove it from the machine. So I definitely recommend making the hat first, because that will kind of give you an idea of what we're doing, and then you can make your scarf next. So I'll just speed this up a little bit as I'm casting off, taking each stitch off onto my needles. And I accidentally dropped a stitch, so I had to fix it as I was going. So just be careful as you're going around that you don't accidentally take 2 off at a time and the stitch kind of unravels on you. And then at the end, when I got back to my number 1 needle, I also marked that with a stitch marker, so I knew where my stop and starting point of my round was. Next, since this was a very long scarf, I had to use 2 skeins of yarn. It was about 2.5 skeins of yarn. So I knotted where I had to add on each skein to the project and secured them into place. Okay, now we're going to do our drop stitch. So remember, the orange needle was my number 1 stitch. and I'm going to drop my first and second stitch to make my drop stitch braid. So you're going to remove those 2 stitches off of your knitting needles. And so this just takes some time kind of finagling it through the needles, but it's a lot easier than just using yarn. So now that we've dropped them, I dropped my number 1 and now my number 2. I'm going to take him off of the needle. And then for now, I'm just going to remove this stitch marker and I'll put it back on when we're done. But this is how we're able to drop just 2 stitches and leave everything else secure because of these circular knitting needles. So now we're just going to pull and those stitches are going to drop. And so you can pull it, or sometimes it might work to use a loom pick or your crochet hook to pick these out. But we're just doing the number 1 and the number 2 stitch that corresponds to the number 1 and number 2 needle on your machine. And so we just pick these out, and you want to pick both stitches out all the way down to almost to the end of where your waist yarn is. And I will show that. And it just takes a moment. You can kind of stretch these out. You can kind of pull and stretch, or you can pick it as you do this. And as you're dropping the stitch, if you can see here, there's always these 2 loops. That's what you always want to see. If you start only getting 1 stitch, you haven't been dropping both stitches all the way down. So you have to go back and kind of pull those out. So you'll see those 2 loops, and that's what you want to keep intact at the very end. So just take your time once you get to your waist yarn. I go pretty slow at this point, and I get to almost to the end of the waist yarn. I only have 1 or 2 rows of my project yarn left, and then I pick these up with my crochet hook at this point, because we want to keep those intact, because that's what we're going to do our slip stitch to braid back up our drop stitch to create this beautiful pattern. And again, I am doing this on the purl side, which is considered the wrong side of the fabric to do this drop stitch. And then I'll do another tutorial on how to do this on the knit side coming soon. So hit that like and follow to see that as well. Once you have those 2 stitches on your crochet hook, I like to pick up 3 bars at a time, and I pull the loops over the bars, just like so, to create the braid drop stitch. And you're going to do this pattern all the way back up to the top of your scarf. At the end of the scarf, you only want to end up with 2 bars left on your crochet hook, because those are the loops that go back onto the needles of your circular knitting machine. So you want to keep the same 48 amount of stitches. So if at the end, if you end up where you have 3 bars and then 3 bars left, This is part 2 of the drop stitch braid tutorial on the purl side making a scarf. So part 1 is going to be linked in the video description below, so take a look at that. This is just finishing up our braids that we have. You can do as many braids as you would like. For this scarf, I just did 4. I dropped the stitches at stitch or needle 1 and 2, 12 and 13, 24 and 25, and 36 and 37. But that's just how I did to make them even, to do 4, but you can do as many braids as you would like. And I am taking 3 bars at a time and doing the slip stitch, but you can do 1 bar at a time up to however many you would like. To make the braid look thicker or smaller, but then just at the end you want to have only 2 loops left on your hook, so pick up 2 bars at the end because you want to put the same amount of stitches back onto your machine. So I use the 48 circular knitting machine, so since I dropped 2 stitches, I want to end with 2 stitches once I've braided it back up to the beginning, which is what this close-up is showing. At the end I will have just put 2 on the crochet hook. So I have 3 here. If you end up where you're going to have 3 left on your crochet hook, the stitch before, put on 4 bars, and you're not going to really see that difference having 4 bars in 1 stitch, because you just want to make sure you end up with 2 at the end. So I have 3 here, and then this one worked out evenly that I have 3 here. So just in case you were going to end up with 3 at the end, put on a 4th one right here if you need to. So then you just have 2 bars at the end. And then we're going to put that back onto our knitting needle. And I have this one, I was putting everything over from the left to the right needle. So just to stay consistent with that, just whichever way you're working in the round. On your knitting needle, just always do the same way to transfer each stitch. And then I'm going to move these around and I'm going to transfer the stitches that we are not going to drop again from my left to my right needle. So then I end up with the 48th stitch that I have the stitch marker in pink. That's the 48th needle stitch. That one's going to be on my right hand needle, and then the orange stitch marker, that's my number 1 needle stitch. That one's going to stay on my left needle. So now the fun part of putting the project back on your circular knitting machine. So I just started, I have my stitch marker on the orange one is my 48th needle. So I just started there and I put the 48th and the 47th needle, and then I started working with needle 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and adding them on. I don't think it really matters where you start, but just I like to be consistent of putting the same stitches back onto the same needles so our round is consistent and the rows are even. I don't know if it makes a difference, but that's what I was thinking in my head, and so that's why I have those stitches marked. The one thing you want to do, and you'll see here on this 47th needle, I get it kind of stuck and not put on exactly right, and so you're going to see it pop off when I start with my waste yarn. So the tip I have is when you're putting these stitches back on to the machine, now I'm putting on my number 1 stitch, it's marked with pink, and I'm putting that back on my number 1 needle, is you want to make sure the stitch is hooked up and under the needle so the needle pulls it down into the machine. Don't put it on your pegs, and the reason being is you'll see when we start to put on our waste yarn after everything is put back on, we want the needles to come up and push that stitch down onto the pegs, and then it will put on the waste yarn and lock everything into place. If you put everything down on the pegs right now, that needle's going to come up when we start putting on our waste yarn, and it's going to pop off the stitch, and then you'll have to fix the drop stitch. So have it hook underneath the needle. So once it's hooked under the needle, then you rotate your handle, and then it will pull that stitch down into the machine. The other tip is just take your time on this part. Now, the other thing you're going to notice is I have the knit side on the inside and the purl side is my exterior, and I still have it that way. So normally when you are cranking your rows, knitting in the round on the machine, you see the purl side and the knit side's underneath. Well, when I removed it, we flipped it inside out so we could make our braided stitches, and then I didn't reflip it back. So I have knit side now facing out, and this is really helpful to have the knit side facing out when we put on the waist yarn. It's really easy to close. Now, if you remember from part 1, when I did the waist yarn, I said what would work better is if to remove it and flip the waist yarn so the knit side's facing and then start cranking your rows. You're going to see why when I close the 2 different sides, because this cast off side is super easy to close because the project is technically inside out back onto the machine. But the cast on side is more difficult to close, and you'll see why, and I'll show you what I did. So it's up to you. You can do it exactly how I did it, or you can flip it like I suggested. And again, I'll do a supplementary video after all the parts to show you how that works. Now we're just adding on the waist yarn, and I started my waist yarn on the left side of my 48th needle so it catches the number 1 needle. And as you can see, none of the stitches are popping off since we had it hooked underneath the needles, and everything is locking into place and working really well. You might just have to help a stitch out every now and then, but everything works really good. But you'll see when I get back to this 47th and 48th needle, right there, the stitch popped off. And so it just wasn't hooked down and around and pulled down tightly onto the needle. So when the needle came up, it pushed the stitch up and off. So that's just the one thing you need to be careful of. When you are going around, you want that stitch to be pushed down onto the 2 pegs at this point, and you just might need to help it out with your loom pick. And then once that's done, it hooks your waist yarn, and now everything's locked into place. And I finished cranking the rest of my waist yarn. I did, I think, 5 or 8 rows of the waist yarn. Once that's done, you can just let the yarn run out and then crank it around one more time with no yarn in it. And then when you crank it around the second time, it will just fall off the machine, and we will do part 3 on how to close the ends of our tubes for our scarf. So thank you so much for watching. Please like and follow, and happy crafting. This is part 3 of our drop stitch braid purl side scarf tutorial. So I'm going to show you how to close up the end of your tube to make it flat. And I'm also going to talk about what I did, but don't do if you want to make it a little bit easier on yourself. So here is the cast off side. This is the easier side to close because you can see I am counting my stitches. It kind of looks like normal if you use waist yarn and you've closed a tube flat before. I count 24 stitches on either side. I start with the tail ends of the yarn at the bottom, and I count 24 stitches on either side of the tube to make the tube even. And then I take my crochet hook, I pick up each 24th stitches, and then I slip stitch them back and forth all the way down to close down the tube. So this is the cast off side. And if you looked at part 3, when we took the project off of the machine, that's how we were able to drop our stitches to make our drop stitch braids, and then we put it back onto the machine. When we put it back onto the machine, the knit side became the interior, and we kept the purl side as the exterior. And so then when we put on our waist yarn, you can see the machine purls the yarn. So when you normally are cranking your rows on your machine, you see the purl side when you're looking the top down view as you're cranking the rows. So I took that off, I flipped it, so it was the knit side, which is the little V's, put it back on the machine, and then I put on my waist yarn. And so this is the easier side to close because the waist yarn, as we're picking up these stitches, is still on the exterior, so we're able to remove it very easily. So I will fast forward this because we'll get to the other side, which is the cast on side, which ends up being the difficult side to do, but I'll teach you how to make it not difficult. So this was kind of a trial and error for me. But this side, we removed the waist yarn, easy peasy, no problem. this side is the cast on side. And what I realized when I went to close this one, to see the stitches to pick them up, you have to curl in the waist yarn so we can see the stitches like the other side to close it up the same. Well, if you close in the stitches, then, or you go to close the stitches like normal, your waist yarn ends up being on the inside, and so you sew in your waist yarn to the inside. So what I ended up doing is I just pre-prepped the waist yarn. Since this is the cast on, the first row of the waist yarn locks in, so I pulled that yarn free, so when I pull the tail into the yarn it just drops really easily. And then I start to slip stitch close the yarn, but you can see I'm now sewing in the waist yarn. But since I did that pre-prep, I was able to very gently pull the yarn and it did all come free. But you could run into an issue of the yarn snagging or knotting, and then you're left with all this waist yarn trapped inside your scarf. So I will make another video of what to do, and what I should have done, and I can explain it here as well, is I should have closed up this end first, because it doesn't matter how you put on your waist yarn. I tried it this way. Obviously this way doesn't work very well. I also tried casting on with my waist yarn. I took it off with my knitting needles, flipped it to the knit side, put it back on the machine, and then I did my rows. But it still does this on one end. You're always going to have a problem end where it wants to close like this. So what you want to do is close this end first, flip it inside out so you can remove the waist yarn from the free open tube end, and then close your easy end like I did, unfortunately, first this time, and then that one is on the outside and it makes it really easy. So that's me trying to explain it. I will do a video showing what to do next in part 4, but you can see here, if you do it this way, it is possible to remove that waist yarn. You just have to be really careful, be slow, and take your time. And I'd kind of have to pull it and stretch it a little bit, and then I would pull very slowly on my waist yarn tail to make sure it didn't snag, and I was just hoping it didn't knot, and fortunately it did not knot. So it can work, but if it knotted in there and you weren't able to get any more out, I'm not really sure what you would need to do. You'd probably have to cut some of these stitches and pull, and you may still end up with some yarn that's hidden in there forever and can't get out. So once I removed all the waist yarn, then I just knotted the tail ends of my yarn. I secured them in place, and then I hid my extra tail ends in between the two layers of the scarf, and this is how it turned out. So I appreciate everybody coming on this journey with me on how to do the scarf with the drop stitch braid on the purl side. Please like and follow for more tutorials. Coming up, I'm going to do the drop stitch braid on the knit side. I am working on those tutorials now. Happy crafting! This is part 4. This is our supplementary video on how to close the tube of the purl side drop stitch scarf, so you don't have the issue as I did of having the waist yarn be hidden inside the tube. So here's an example for you. This is what I did for a scarf, and this is the normal waist yarn cast on and cast off. And what you do is when you go to close your tube, you have the knit side facing out, and then you pick up your live stitches and you stitch it all the way down on the purl side, and then you remove your waist yarn and everything's fine. But if you want your purl side to be your exterior, so let me flip this around. If we just cast on with our waist yarn like normal, and we go to close it, you'll see the issue we run into is if we go to close it, we have to look at our live stitches to pick up, which is on the purl side. But when I go to close this, you pick up these live stitches, you're going to stitch closed your tube with the waist yarn inside. Now I was able, if you go back to part 2 and part 3, I was able to successfully remove the waist yarn from that, but you could potentially have it knot and get stuck. So here is what you need to do to make sure you don't get your waist yarn caught inside of your scarf when you go to close it. So here is what the purl side looks like when it's all closed up, and it makes a nice, really pretty pattern, and you can't even tell where you close the tube at, which is really cool. So how to accomplish this without getting the waste yarn stuck. So first you're going to cast on with your waste yarn, and this is good to be in a similar weight yarn to your project yarn, but in a contrasting color so you can see the stitches of your project yarn so you know what stitches to pick up. And I like to do between 5 and 10 rows. And then we are going to put on our project yarn, and you want to crank out as many rows as you need for your project yarn. Now this one's just going to be a sample. And so I just crank as many rows as needed. Now we're going to take our circular knitting needles and we're going to cast off with them. And so we're going to do that by picking up each stitch one time around, just like you normally would if you go to cast off with the needle and the project yarn. And this is because we need to flip it and re-put it back on the machine so the knit side is facing us. Right now with the project on the machine like this, we are seeing the purl side, and that's the bar side, and the knit side, or the little V-stitch side, is on the bottom. So we want to flip it at this point. So we need to completely take it off the machine, and I'll speed this up for us. And now that it's off the machine after we get these last few stitches, and they're all secured and they're not going to drop because they're all on this circular knitting needles with the cord, now we're going to flip the project so the knit side is facing us. So this is the knit side, that's the part that's usually underneath on the machine, and this is the purl side, which looks like the bars. That's the part you usually see when you're cranking your rows. So we want to flip this inside out, so the knit side's on our inside, because for this particular project we want the purl side to be our exterior. So now that the knit side is facing us, or facing up you could say, on the machine, we want to put back each stitch onto the machine. And it's really good to have a loom pick at this point. That really helps. And I start with the number 1 needle, and then you want the stitch to catch underneath the hook of the needle. You do not want it to go all the way down on the small pegs. The reason being, when you crank all the way around and you go to add on your waste yarn, if it's not hooked on the needle but actually on the pegs, the needle is just going to come up and it's going to pop off your stitch, and then it can drop and you have to fix it. So to not have to do that, just have it hook underneath the needle so it pulls it down into the machine. And then I'm just going to fast forward this, but you do each stitch all the way back onto your machine. And so it just takes a little bit of time. Once you have all the stitches back onto the machine, now we're going to put on our cast off waste yarn. And when the machine cranks the rows, it's going to purl them again. And this is going to make it so your cast off side is going to be easy to close. Your cast on side is going to be what I call like the problem child, the hard side to close. I have tried it where I did the cast on, took it off the machine, flipped it, did my project yarn, and then I took that off, flipped it, put it back on, and did the waste yarn. It didn't matter. I still had a problem side. So for your cast on, no need to take that off. And so you see you're going to have one side that's going to be easy to close because you're going to be able to pick up the live stitches and the waste yarn will be on the exterior. But this other side, it doesn't matter. This is the cast on side. It doesn't matter if you take and flip the waste yarn or not. Either way, that waste yarn, when you go to close up the tube, if the purl side is on the exterior of your project, you are going to sew in your waste yarn, and you're going to have to be very careful on removing it and hope that it doesn't knot. So all we need to do to correct this is we just want to close up the problem side first. When I did my scarf, I didn't think about that, and I closed up the easy side first, and then that's when I had the issue of trying to really gently remove the waste yarn. And I was successful, but it could have knotted and I could have had yarn stuck inside the project. So all you need to do is flip your project where the knit side is on the exterior and the purl side's on the interior, so we can see our stitches. And then we can make sure the waste yarn, when you go to sew it up, is going to be on the exterior. And so I just count my stitches starting at the tail ends. I put that at the bottom of the tube and I count 24 on each side, so I know that it's even because we have 48 needles. Then I pick up the two 24th stitches on either side that's at the top of the tube, and then I slip stitch them back and forth all the way down to close the tube. So if I had this with the purl side facing out, we would be sewing up that waist yarn inside our scarf. So that's what you don't want to do. And since we flipped it inside out and the waist yarn's on the exterior, you can tell this is the cast on side as well because it's all locked into place, and I have to pull this first set of yarn out so we can unravel it. The other option would be to do the ravel cord cast on, which I also have a tutorial on, but I just wanted to show this. So now once all the waist yarn is removed, then we can now flip it purl side facing out, because now we're going to close up the cast off side of the tube. So we have our purl side facing out because this was a purl side drop stitch braid that we did in our tutorial. And then we are going to close up this tube. And as you can see, since we flipped the project on the machine, put it back on, then to do our cast off, now it will work to close up the project. The waist yarn is on the exterior and you don't have to worry about getting it stuck in the machine. So I hope this helped if you do the drop stitch braid tutorial, purl side facing out, how to close up the tube without closing up your waist yarn inside the tube. And I have part 1, 2, and 3 linked in the video description below on how to do the drop stitch braid scarf purl side. And as you can see, once our waist yarn is removed, now we have both of our ends closed up on our purl side. So please like and follow for more. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me in the comments, and happy crafting.